Hey everybody, welcome back for another demo. Really excited about this one. I had an interesting scenario come up in my day job this week where we had been building a report that had a bunch of gauges on it, and we needed to engineer a custom solution because our stakeholders just weren't very happy with the way that the gauges were looking. I mean, of course, they were the ones that requested the gauges in the first place. Usually, if left to my own devices, you will never see me use the gauge visual in Power BI in the first place. But hey, they're easy to read. Some people like gauges, no problem. But the issue that we were running into is that when you're using gauge visuals in Power BI, based on how you format them and based on how your company is progressing towards their goals, we know that the gauge visuals can become different sizes or they don't all quite look as clean as I would like for them to look. So the other problem that we were running into that was even added another entirely different level of complexity was that we also realized in order to fit everything into the area of Power BI that we had allocated for these gauges, we were going to need to rotate them 90 degrees. So that definitely gave us some pause. You obviously can't rotate the gauge visual in Power BI. We were trying to figure out how we're going to get around this one. And so I had the idea that really, you can make your own gauge visual using a pie chart or a donut chart, just using math. So what decided to do was engineer my own custom gauge solution using the donut chart. I thought that it worked brilliantly. It was surprisingly easy to set up, and I thought that if you ever run into similar situations where you need an alternative to a gauge that still looks and performs like a gauge but maybe gives you some additional flexibility, and most importantly, all of your gauges are always going to look the same size, then this might be a solution that you can use. So really excited to show you how I turned the donut chart into a really cool gauge alternative. So here I've got a quick Power BI report that I stood up just showing a few examples of the gauge visual in Power BI with just some fake products that I created in a very small quick data set. And all of these gauges are just measuring hypothetical year-to-date sales versus the sales goals that I also just made up for the purpose of making some gauges. And the problem that we're trying to solve with this tutorial, first of all, is that the gauge visual is just kind of boring. It's always going to look like this. You're pretty limited in how you can display it, how you can format it. And also, the most annoying thing about the gauge visual in Power BI, in my opinion, is that based on where this target label is located, it completely resizes the gauge. And if you look at this and you don't understand what I'm talking about, I'm going to go ahead and just go to Insert in my ribbon, and I'm going to do something that I do all the time, and that is just drop a rectangle onto the page so that I can use it as a makeshift ruler. And looking at this ruler and holding it against the top of my gauges, I can see that, gauge A is one size, gauge B has just a little bit more white space between it and the bottom of the ruler, gauge 3 has quite a bit of white space, and gauge 4 looks more or less the same as A. And if I drag this ruler down to the bottom, you can also see that actually the gauge for product D is by far the largest. You can see that product C is the smallest, and again, A and B are pretty comparable with each other, but it absolutely infuriates the anal retentive part of me that wants all 4 of these gauges to be the same size, regardless of how we're progressing towards our goal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a workaround using the donut chart that's going to allow us to use math to create a completely unique visual that does the same thing as the gauge, but also opens up some new options. Now, I will state that I am not saying that this solution is better in all circumstances than the gauge visual. If you have to use a gauge visual, you could do worse. Just for me, there are some things about the gauge visual that I find a little bit limiting. And I was able to use this solution on a product in my day job. And I thought that it was really cool the way that I was able to deliver this. But I will absolutely admit that this is more of a cosmetic solution than an efficient one. I had a specific situation where I was basically running out of room on the page because of how much space these gauges take up, and I needed something that would allow me to kind of get creative. So in order to turn the donut chart into a gauge, we are going to have to write a fair number of relatively simple measures that are going to help us sort of break down the math that makes up the different components of this gauge so that we can sort of game the donut chart into something that looks more or less similar to this but opens up some new options. So don't be afraid of the math. Again, it's all relatively simple and I'm going to walk you through it one step at a time. The first thing that I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go ahead and create a table here for my products so that you can kind of follow along on the math with me. So first I'm going to go ahead and drop my current year sales and my sales goal into this table just so you can sort of see, how much progress we're making, which products are behind on their goal, which ones are ahead. I think that there's only one in this data set that is actually exceeding its sales goal, and that is product F. So we'll return to that here in just a moment. And the first measure that I'm going to create is I'm going to delete my placeholder measure here. And I'm going to create a measure called O1 sales progress percent. And this first measure is literally just our progress towards our sales goal expressed as a percentage. For all intents and purposes, this is just the blue part of this gauge here. And I'm literally going to break this gauge apart one step at a time. So my second measure here, which will be labeled O2, is going to be kind of this gray part between the blue part of the gauge and this little bar here that that indicates where my goal is. And then the third measure is going to be the goal itself. The fourth measure is going to be kind of this leftover or padding gray area in this gauge. And then from there are just a couple of more measures to write and we're done. But let me go ahead and finish this first measure, and that is going to be our progress towards our sales goal. I'm just going to go ahead and sum my current year sales, and I'm going to divide that by my sales goal. And I'm going to go ahead and make sure that this is expressed as a percentage. I'm going to go ahead and give it one decimal place. I'm just going to go ahead and drop this into my table so that I can just kind of spot check everything and make sure it looks right. My second measure, as I said, is going to be the space here, this gray space between the blue part that is filled in and my goal. So in order to get this, what we're literally doing is we're going to subtract from 100% of our goal the percentage of our goal that we've already reached. So this is going to be O2 goal minus sales progress. And that might sound fancy, but it's really just 100% minus the amount of our goal that we've already attained. It's also going to be a percentage. I'm just going to leave that with one decimal place, drag it there. And of course, the first measure plus the second measure is going to add up to 100% of our goal. So basically, this plus this equals 100% of our goal. That's exactly the way that the gauge works. The next measure might be a little bit confusing at first, but this is literally just going to be a super, super tiny number that is going to serve as a makeshift line in our donut chart to indicate, where our goal is. So I'm just going to go ahead and drop that there. I realized that I forgot an underscore at the beginning of my first measure. That's why they were out of order. So for my fourth measure, what I'm creating is just a little bit of padding between the end of my gauge and my goal. We don't want the goal line to be right here. It makes it kind of hard to see if we're like exceeding it. And visually it just doesn't look as appealing. So we need to have a little bit of padding here. And that's literally what I'm going to call this measure. And the amount of padding that you choose is up to you. I'm going to show you what I use, but really this is a measure that you can kind of play with to make the gauge look better. And all we're going to do to create this padding is we're just going to add up the two major components of the gauge here, and we're just going to multiply it by something to leave us with a little bit of cushion at the end of our gauge. And at this point, it would probably be useful to go ahead and start setting up this donut chart so that you can kind of follow along and visually see how everything is coming together. So of course, donut charts operate on a scale of 100%. So when we drop this first measure, everything is going to be 100%. I'm also going to go ahead and add a filter to this visual so that we're just looking at product A. There's my 62.6%, which matches to this. But in donut chart terms, since this is just one measure, it's only, everything's going to add up to 100%. So 62.6, I'm going to go ahead and add the next part of the gauge, which is basically the amount between how much of our sales target we've hit and the sales target itself. So this is going to be that 37.4% here. I'm going to go ahead and add my goal line, which you can see is a very, very small, just kind of a sliver here within the donut chart, which is great because it's basically going to be, this line here that you see on the gauges sort of indicating where our target threshold is. And then here is the padding that we have left over. So the next thing that we're going to do is you can see that all of these gauges roughly make up a half circle. And so since we're dealing with a donut chart, imagine that these gauges were donut charts. Basically, there's an entire portion that is just white, that is just emptied out. It's basically 50% of the gauge is just white. We're not seeing it. All the gauge is happening up here. So we're going to create the same effect in our donut chart here by creating a fifth measure that is just empty space. And since we want this empty space to take up exactly half of the donut chart, we basically need to create a measure that contains everything that we've already written so far. It just makes sense that if these four measures are adding up to 100%, in order to force them to just occupy 50% of this donut chart, we need to create a measure that basically takes up the other 50% of the chart. So I'm just going to go ahead and quickly add up all of our other measures. And I'm going to go ahead and drop this into place. And this should take up exactly half of the donut chart. And you can see that it does. So now we've basically got everything that we need for our gauge. The problem now is just formatting it so that it looks a little bit more like this. So I'm going to go ahead and just turn off my details. I don't need them. And in fact, the detail labels are actually pretty confusing in the context of a donut chart. I'm also going to turn off my legend because I don't need people really seeing all of the measures that make up, just the math. We just need them to see the gauge and know how we're progressing towards our sales goals. I'm going to go ahead and open up my slices here. My empty space obviously just needs to be white. Okay, now this is already looking a lot more like a gauge, right? And my sales progress, it's totally fine to just keep that blue. The 100% of goal minus my sales progress, I just want to be gray like you see up here, so I can just make that gray. My goal line needs to be fairly prominent, so I'm going to keep that dark, and then my padding also needs to be gray. So there you go. We've already effectively created our gauge. The only thing that's left to do now is just to kind of reorient this. I'm not a huge fan of reading gauges from top to bottom, so we do want to move a few things around. And in order to do that, we're just going to take the pieces that make up our, the measures that make up the actual gauge, and we're just going to kind of reorder them so that the gauge is going in the other direction. So all I did was, instead of numbering these 1, 2, 3, 4, I just grabbed the pieces of the gauge and just reordered them so that now they're going in the opposite order. And so now my gauge is going in a way that to me is at least a little bit more intuitive. So, we have our gauge, it's taking up 50% of the donut chart. If you want to play with, the curvature of your donut chart a little bit, you absolutely can do that by just kind of playing with the math around your empty space. If you want the empty space to take up 50% of the donut chart, that's great. If you want it to take up less space, all you need to do is just start multiplying it, by some fraction, less than 1. So if I multiply this times, 0.9, you can see over here that it got a little bit longer. I'm going to go ahead and do that again and drop it to 70%. And ultimately, I'm just going to settle on making it 50%. So now you can see that my gauge is a little bit more curved than what you would see in the standard gauge, takes up a little bit more space, and we have maybe a third of it over here to work with. And since we're now in a donut chart, I'm also going to go ahead and turn off the title. The title doesn't really make all that much sense here. Although if you wanted to create your own title that was a little bit more intuitive here, like progress towards sales goal for product A, this would be a wonderful time to go ahead and add something like that, just to, give your whoever's looking at this a little bit more context as to what kind of gauge they're looking at. But since we are building a donut chart here, we can now leverage all of the features that come with a donut chart. If we want to change the spacing on this gauge from 60% to 80% or something like that, or if we want to rotate this, we can do that. So I'm going to go ahead and just start rotating this a little bit more. And now we can start playing with this white space. I mean, the whole reason that you would use a donut chart is because you have this wonderful white space here where you can add additional kind of descriptive context, about this chart. So I'm going to go ahead and just grab a card visual, and I'm going to first just put into this our progress towards our sales goal. After all, that's kind of the headline. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that this is also set on product A, 62.6%. That's what I want. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that the background is turned off here so that I can see my beautiful new gauge in the background. I'm going to just change the color of this to blue so that it kind of ties to the part of the gauge that is filled in. And I'm just going to go ahead and turn off the label for now. Next, I'm going to go ahead and create two more measures. They're just going to be text measures to kind of fill in, give a little bit more information around this donut chart or around this donut chart gauge hybrid. And so I'm going to go ahead and create a measure that I'll call sales text. And this is literally just going to be current year sales, just a string value, and I'm going to concatenate to that a formatted sum of my current year sales. I'm going to format that as currency and go ahead and add another measure, or another card rather. Make sure that it is filtered for product A. I'm going to go ahead and add my sales text there. Looks exactly like I was hoping it would. I'm going to go ahead and drop the font down to 18, quite a bit smaller. Make sure that my background is turned off. And if somebody wants a little bit more context, such as what the goal is, no problem. You can create a goal text measure just as easily. I'll call this goal text with goal, and I'm going to format that also as a currency. And I'll go ahead and swap out sales text there with goal, drag it so that they are roughly even. And if you want to play with the formatting options a little bit, you obviously can to your heart's content. If you want to bump up your font size on current year sales goal, no problem. If you want to continue to kind of drag all of this into place. And there you go. Now we've got a very, very quick and easy alternative to the gauge that uses the donut chart, but basically creates a gauge that, in my opinion, maybe looks a little bit more visually appealing. It's not quite as vanilla or boring as the standard gauge charts that we've got up here. I'll go ahead and delete this table here, but there is one more thing that I do want to point out to you that you will run into as these gauges, hopefully for your company, hit 100%. And there is one part of the equation that we do need to manage, before we call this video a day and before I wrap it up. Notice that product F has already exceeded its goal. So let's go ahead and see what happens when we start pointing all of these visuals that we created at product F instead of product A. Because I would definitely be curious to know what happens to this gauge when we actually exceed our goal. And so I'm going to go ahead and swap out product A with product F. And you can see that really it kind of stops where we reach our threshold. Because we haven't, in our math and in these measures, we haven't made any allowance for there to be an additional space above the goal threshold that is, in effect, overflow for when we've exceeded our goal. So I'm just going to create one more measure here. This is the most complex measure that we're going to write in this entire video, just because it does have some conditional logic in it. And we're going to create an if slash switch statement that is just going to swap the output of our measure based on different criteria. And the criteria here is, what are we going to do when our progress towards our sales goal exceeds 1? And in this situation, what we're going to want to have happen is we're going to figure out a way, we're going to want to have a way at getting at the 7.9% here that is left over after we hit 100% of our goal. And so in order to get to that, we are going to take our sales progress measure, which in this case is 107.9%. We're going to subtract 1 so that we're left with 7.9%. And this is going to be the amount of our overflow. And then in all instances where our progress towards goal is not exceeding 100, we don't even need to worry about this measure, just like we currently have here. So I'm just going to go ahead and leave the output blank when we haven't reached our goal yet. Once I have that last measure, I'm just going to go ahead and click on my chart here. And where I want to insert this value is between my goal measure and my padding here. So it's going to go right here between 03 and 04. And so I'm going to go ahead and drag that, drop it into place. Immediately you can see that I've got some overflow here in this this orange section. If you're like me, maybe leaving it orange isn't the worst idea. It's really highlighting that we've exceeded our goal, but I tend to be a little bit more subtle on things, for better or worse. And so in this instance, instead of leaving it orange, I'm just going to make it a lighter shade of blue to sort of indicate that we've already surpassed our goal, but not being too on the nose about it. And then if you want to just, continue to play with the formatting and budging things to your heart's content, you can. Obviously, if you wanted to change your title so that it's talking about the right product, that would probably be highly recommended. So progress towards sales goal for product F. You could even create some conditional logic for this title if you wanted to be like, congratulations, product F has exceeded its goal. That's probably material for another video, but there you have it. Relatively, simple way, just a handful of measures needed to create something that, in my opinion, is just a lot more interesting to look at than the gauge visual, and also a lot easier to size, a lot easier to rotate, a lot easier to sort of leverage the empty space that you have in a donut chart, because you're kind of just layering everything together to make this cool new visual that, in my opinion, might look like something you downloaded from the Power BI Marketplace, but in fact you built it using things that are already right there at your disposal. So there you go. I hope that you found that video super, super useful. I thought it was one of the more creative solutions that I had to come up with for a while. Really, really hope that my day job keeps kind of forcing me to find really creative solutions to engineer in Power BI. And as those scenarios come up, I can't wait to record more YouTube videos and sort of share my solutions with you all. Hope you keep checking out future tips and tricks from me, Sean Chandler, in Power BI, and I'm looking so forward to seeing you in the next video.